I have spent most of my life watching how people behave around money. Not how they talk about money in public. Not how they perform confidence at dinner tables or on television. I mean how they actually behave when the room gets quiet, when the bills are real, when the car starts making a noise it did not make last week, when the furnace dies in the middle of winter, when the boss calls an unexpected meeting, when the pharmacy says the prescription will cost more than expected, when a child needs help, when a parent needs help, when the dog gets sick, when the laptop goes black 5 minutes before an important deadline. That is where you find the truth. The truth is that most people are not destroyed by one giant catastrophe. They are worn down by fragility. They are worn down by the knowledge that one ordinary problem, one boring problem, one completely unremarkable problem can shove their entire life off balance. That kind of pressure changes a human being. It changes how you sleep. It changes how you talk. It changes how you negotiate. It changes what kind of risks you are willing to take. And, even more important, what kind of opportunities you are too afraid to take. It changes your marriage, your patience, your ambition, your posture, your health, your willingness to tell the truth, your ability to say no, and your ability to think longer than the next Friday. A great many people think the first major financial milestone must be $100,000, or $500,000, or $1 million. That is how the world likes big, round, glamorous numbers, because big, round, glamorous numbers sell books, courses, conferences, and fantasies. But life is not changed first by glamour. Life is changed first by margin. And the first meaningful margin for a great many people is not a mansion, and it is not a trust fund. It is the first real pool of cash that stands between them and panic. For many households, that number is $10,000. I am not saying $10,000 makes you rich. It does not. I am not saying $10,000 frees you from work forever. It does not. I am not saying $10,000 solves every medical problem, every career problem, every family problem, or every market problem. It does not. What I am saying is more practical. $10,000 is often the line where life stops feeling like a series of financial ambushes and starts feeling, for the first time, even if only faintly, like something you can steer. That is a profound change. People who have never lived without margin often underestimate what this means. When you have no cushion, or a cushion so thin that one flat tire can break it. Every decision contains an invisible tax. A friend invites you to dinner, and the decision is not about companionship or appetite. It is about whether that meal will create a problem 3 days later. Your manager asks whether you would be willing to relocate for a better position. And the decision is not about advancement or geography. It is about whether a security deposit, a moving truck, and one delayed paycheck could put you underwater. A class becomes available that might increase your earning power, and the decision is not about the value of the class. It is about whether the upfront cost exposes you to a disaster if something else goes wrong in the same month. That is how a fragile financial life traps a person. It does not merely limit spending. It narrows thought. It shortens time horizons. It forces every choice to report to the emergency of the present moment. There are investors who spend all their time talking about return on capital. I have no objection to that. It is an important concept. But before most people can earn a return on capital, they need to own some emotional stability around capital. If every dollar has to play defense every hour of the day, then that household is not yet in a position to think like an owner. They are still thinking like prey. That may sound severe, but I do not mean it cruelly. I mean it accurately. A household without reserves is exposed in a way that changes the nervous system itself. You can watch it. You do not need a laboratory to see it. You can hear it in a husband and wife snapping at each other over small things that are not really small things at all. You can see it in the eyes of a person opening their bank app in a parking lot before deciding whether they can walk into a store. You can hear it in the fake casualness of someone saying they are too tired to go out tonight, when what they really mean is that the restaurant would hit the checking account too hard. You can see it in the employee who knows the job is wrong, knows the boss is abusive, knows the future is limited, but cannot afford 1 month of uncertainty and therefore calls stagnation prudence. When people live that way long enough, they begin to confuse captivity with maturity. They tell themselves they are being realistic. Sometimes they are, but many times they are simply underfunded. That is why I care about the first $10,000 more than many people might expect. It is not because there is nothing mystical about 5 figures. The importance of the number comes from what it tends to cover. It covers the check engine light that turns into an alternator and a battery. It covers the dental bill that insurance turns into a negotiation with reality. It covers the dead laptop, the urgent flight, the missed week of work, the plumbing leak, the furnace repair, the emergency vet visit, the deposit on an apartment, the deductible after a minor accident, the temporary gap between one job and the next. It does not cover every catastrophe. It does not need to. It covers enough of life's most common blows that the owner of that cash balance no longer experiences ordinary uncertainty as existential danger. That one change cascades into everything else. If you want to understand money, never start with spreadsheets alone. Start with behavior. A person with no reserves is forced into bad bargains. They overpay because they cannot wait. They borrow because they cannot absorb a delay. They accept lousy terms because the alternative is too risky. They tolerate demeaning treatment because walking away requires runway. They decline opportunity because opportunity often arrives dressed like inconvenience before it arrives dressed like reward. That last point matters enormously. A great many fortunes are not built because a person lacked intelligence. They are not built because a person lacked character. They are not built because a person lacked an entry ticket to optionality. When I was younger, people liked to think wealth came from some dramatic act of brilliance. Sometimes it does. Far more often it comes from a quieter advantage. The quiet advantage is the ability to think one move further than the frightened man next to you. The person with $10,000 is still far from rich. But in one crucial respect, that person is already living in a different mental universe than the person with zero. The person with zero must ask, what happens if something goes wrong? The person with 10,000 can begin asking, what should I do if something goes right? That is a completely different orientation to life. It changes the way you evaluate a course, a side business, a relocation, an introduction, a negotiation, a weekend project, a new skill, a better apartment closer to a better labor market, an unpaid internship with real upside, or a period of deliberate job search instead of panicked acceptance. There is another point here that people miss. Most people think the benefit of an emergency fund appears only when the emergency arrives. That is not true. The biggest benefit often appears on all the days when nothing happens. That is where the real dividend is paid. The dividend is not just dollars. The dividend is reduced fear. The dividend is fewer bad decisions made under pressure. The dividend is better sleep. The dividend is less resentment. The dividend is less shame. The dividend is less frantic mental arithmetic in grocery aisles, less bargaining with your own dignity, less pretending, less hiding, less rehearsing excuses, less dependence on luck. A person who sleeps better makes better decisions. A person who makes better decisions compounds better outcomes. A person who is not exhausted from financial vigilance can redirect attention toward actual progress. That is one of the reasons I have always admired simplicity in finance. Simple things, done consistently, create room, room creates thought, thought creates better action compounds. The world wants people to believe wealth begins with sophistication. It often begins with breathing room. Now, $10,000 does not appear because someone suddenly becomes wise one Tuesday afternoon. It usually arrives because something deeper changed first. The real milestone is not the balance itself. The real milestone is the identity shift that produced the balance. This is where most financial commentary is too shallow. It tells people to save, fine. But human beings do not sustain difficult behavior for long merely because they received an instruction. They sustain behavior when the behavior becomes congruent with how they see themselves. The person who saves $10,000 has usually stopped seeing saving as a temporary punishment. That person has started to see saving as part of who they are. That is no small thing. A person can white-knuckle a budget for a few weeks. A person can cancel a few subscriptions in a burst of guilt. A person can promise to stop eating out until the next birthday or holiday or rough day at work. That is not transformation. Transformation happens when the internal sentence changes. The sentence stops being, I am trying to save money. It becomes, I am a person who leaves room. That sentence changes everything. A person who leaves room notices different things. They notice the monthly leak that seemed too small to matter. They notice the habit purchases that were never really about utility. They notice the expensive conveniences that had become emotional reflexes. They notice how often fatigue spends money. They notice how often insecurity spends money. They notice how often ego spends money. They notice how often imitation spends money. Most people do not go broke from one large act of insanity. They go broke from hundreds of small votes cast in favor of a life that feels expensive to maintain and empty to inhabit. The $10,000 does not just sit there, it stands as evidence that those votes have begun to change, and because it stands as evidence, it changes confidence. I want to be precise here because confidence is often misunderstood. I am not talking about swagger, I am not talking about loud optimism or performative abundance. I am talking about the quiet confidence of someone who is no longer negotiating every sentence with desperation. That person can say no to a bad deal. That person can ask for another week before making a decision. That person can compare insurance rates instead of auto-renewing from exhaustion. That person can challenge an incorrect bill instead of paying it immediately out of fear. That person can take a Saturday to think about a job offer instead of accepting the first thing put in front of them. That person can absorb a mistake without having to turn the mistake into a crisis. The ability to absorb a mistake is one of the great underappreciated luxuries in life. It gives learning a chance to exist. People who cannot afford mistakes are often forced to repeat them, not because they are fools, because they are cornered. I have often said that the stock market is a device for transferring money from the impatient to the patient. Something similar is true in ordinary life. Financial fragility transfers freedom from the underbuffered to the well-buffered. The underbuffered person pays rush fees, overdraft fees, late fees, high interest, poor insurance choices, weak negotiating positions, bad credit terms, hasty labor contracts, bad housing timing, unnecessary stress, and career stagnation. The buffered person does not avoid every problem. But the buffered person has time. Time is a hidden asset class. People think only in terms of dollars, but time and calm are productive assets. $10,000 frequently buys enough time to think. Enough time to think is often worth far more than the nominal return that money might have earned somewhere else in the short run. Some young people ask me whether they should invest every spare dollar the moment they have it. I understand the enthusiasm, I admire it. But there is a dangerous romance around investing before stability. An emergency fund may not look exciting on a chart. It may not let you boast about market gains. It may not feel like progress in the way an investment account does. Yet, for many households, the best early return comes not from owning more risk assets, but from reducing the chance that one stupid event will force them to liquidate at the worst possible time, borrow at a punitive rate, or take a humiliating step backward. That is a return. It is not always visible. It is often decisive. A reserve fund changes your relationship with risk in a healthier way. When you have nothing, every risk looks too large and every shortcut looks too tempting. That is a dangerous combination. It produces caution where courage is needed and recklessness where prudence is needed. A person with no reserves may be too frightened to move for a better job and too willing to run a credit card balance to preserve appearances. That is upside down. A person with reserves begins to sort risk more intelligently. They can tolerate temporary uncertainty in pursuit of better long-term prospects while refusing the foolish risks that come from being cornered. That is what maturity actually looks like. Not the absence of desire, not the performance of discipline for other people. Maturity is the ability to align short-term decisions with long-term stability. Cash reserves help create that alignment. I also want to say something unfashionable. A great deal of financial pain comes from trying to look solved before one is stable. There is enormous social pressure to display progress. The better car, the nicer apartment, the trip, the upgraded phone, the branded groceries, the constant paid convenience, the wardrobe that signals momentum, the dining habit that signals belonging, the furniture financed into the present to make the future look more respectable. None of these things are inherently evil, but when they are purchased before margin exists, they become agents of dependency. They do not merely cost money. They make flexibility more expensive. And flexibility, especially in the early and middle years of life, is often worth far more than polish. The first $10,000 is in some ways a declaration that flexibility has become more important than display. That declaration is often the beginning of adulthood in its most useful sense, not legal adulthood, not social adulthood, economic adulthood. Economic adulthood begins when you stop spending to mute anxiety and start building buffers that reduce the need for anxiety in the first place. That is a far more durable solution. People who have never crossed that line sometimes imagine the experience as a dramatic moment. They think a person opens the banking app, sees a 5-figure balance, and instantly becomes serene, wise, and methodical. Life is not theatrical that way. The change is usually quieter. You notice that an ordinary surprise no longer ruins the week. You notice that the car repair estimate causes irritation rather than dread. You notice that when a manager behaves badly, your mind goes to alternatives instead of paralysis. You notice that you can buy a plane ticket for an urgent family matter without wondering whether rent is now in danger. You notice that you can think about learning, moving, negotiating, and planning without your heartbeat joining the conversation. These are small changes in isolation. Together they amount to a new life. There is also something else that happens at this stage that is critically important. You begin to understand money not merely as consumption power but as option value. That is one of the great divides between people who build wealth and people who merely earn income. Income tells you what you can buy today. Stored cash begins teaching you what you can refuse, what you can delay, what you can survive, and what you can choose. That is a deeper education than many people ever receive. A man with a high salary and no reserves can look impressive while being strategically weak. A woman with a modest salary and real reserves can look ordinary while being strategically strong. The world often misprices those two conditions because the world is mesmerized by visible income and visible consumption. But visible consumption is easy to fake. Optionality is harder to fake. The person with reserves can walk away. That matters in work. That matters in business. That matters in relationships. That matters in housing. That matters in negotiations large and small. If I had to compress much of practical finance into one sentence, it would be this. The person who can wait has more power than the person who must agree. $10,000 is often the beginning of being able to wait. Not forever, not in every circumstance, but enough to matter. And enough to matter is enough to change the trajectory. Some people object that $10,000 sounds impossible when they are struggling to save even $100. I do not dismiss that objection. For many households, the arithmetic is genuinely hard. Housing is expensive. Transportation is expensive. Healthcare is expensive. Childcare is expensive. Mistakes are expensive. And wages, for many, have not kept up with the sense of pressure they live under. Still, the practical answer remains the same. You do not build $10,000 in one heroic gesture. You build it by proving to yourself repeatedly that room matters. The first $500 matters. The first 1,000 matters. The second 1,000 matters. Each step is not merely more money. Each step is evidence. Evidence changes identity. Behavior changes outcomes. Then the curve begins to tilt. At the beginning it feels brutally slow. That is normal. The early phase of building reserves is difficult because every saved dollar is competing against a life already structured to consume it. But each month that a little room survives, the saver becomes harder to bully. That is what you are really building, not just a balance. Resistance to coercion. Resistance to panic. Resistance to bad timing. Resistance to humiliation. Resistance to the need to say yes too quickly. People underestimate how much of poor financial life comes from saying yes too quickly. Yes to the loan. Yes to the lease. Yes to the job. Yes to the purchase. Yes to the repair contract. Yes to the convenience. Yes to the invitation. Yes to the pressure. The reason many of those yeses are expensive is that they were not chosen from strength. They were chosen from exposure. Exposure is costly. Reserves reduce exposure. That is why this first milestone matters more than many glamorous milestones that come later. By the time a person has built $10,000 honestly, through decisions, restraint, adjustment, and consistency, they have already acquired several of the habits that matter most in wealth building. They have learned to distinguish discomfort from danger. They have learned that many cravings are temporary, but many savings are permanent, in effect. They have learned that status spending is often just rented self-assurance. They have learned that small recurring savings are not trivial if they preserve optionality. They have learned that waiting is not always losing. They have learned that cash can represent self-respect. They have learned that emergencies feel different when they do not threaten identity. Those lessons are not minor. Those lessons are the foundation on which larger fortunes stand. The public likes to talk about earning more. There is nothing wrong with earning more. It helps. But earning more without changing the internal relationship to money often just finances a more elaborate version of the same fragility. A person can go from $40,000 to $80,000 in income and still live on a knife edge if every increase is consumed by lifestyle inflation, debt obligations, upgraded expectations, and new fixed expenses. Then the pressure returns wearing nicer clothes, a person who learns to preserve room. On the other hand, carries a transferable skill. That person can earn more and keep more. That person can endure volatility better. That person can allocate capital with more intelligence later because the emotional groundwork has been laid. That is why I would rather back the disciplined saver with modest income than the showy earner with nothing behind the curtain. The saver has already demonstrated the habit from which capital grows. The other person has demonstrated appetite. Appetite is common. Retention is rare. I have watched many people build the first meaningful reserve of their lives and then experience something almost amusing in its simplicity. They start noticing opportunities that had always been there. The course that looked too expensive now looks like a rational investment. The low-cost move to a better market now looks possible. The side business idea that once felt irresponsible now looks testable. The chance to take a few weeks between jobs to search properly instead of desperately now looks attainable. The problem is not that these opportunities were invisible before. The problem is that they were unaffordable emotionally, even if they might have been attractive economically. Fear had raised their price. Cash lowered it. That is why cash is not dead weight in the early stages of a financial life. It is strategic dry powder. It is insulation. It is dignity. It is negotiating leverage. It is the right to think. And just as important, it is the first proof that money can stop being only a source of pressure and start becoming a source of structure. Once a person experiences that, their ambitions often change in quality. They stop fantasizing only about escape. They begin planning for architecture. That is a better stage to inhabit. Escape is emotional. Architecture is durable. Escape says, how do I get out of this month? Architecture says, how do I build a life that does not collapse from ordinary stress? $10,000 is often the first brick in that architecture. It is not the whole building, but a building with no first brick never appears. Let me say one more thing about peace of mind, because people routinely understate it. Peace of mind is not a soft benefit. It is not an indulgence. It is not an extra peace of mind alters cognition. A calmer person can compare options. A calmer person can listen. A calmer person can spot nonsense. A calmer person can bargain. A calmer person can parent better. A calmer person can recover faster from setbacks. A calmer person can endure the time it takes for good decisions to pay off. If $10,000 reduces the frequency with which fear hijacks your judgment, then the value of that cash is larger than the balance itself. It is buying a better operator. The operator is you, and a better operator is one of the highest yielding assets available. I also find it useful to remember that not every gain from financial stability appears on an account statement. Some gains show up as conversations not had, arguments avoided, embarrassments escaped. Predatory lenders never called, panic purchases never made, sleep regained, humiliation deferred, truth spoken, better terms obtained. Those outcomes rarely get counted. They should. Many people are living as though they are one unlucky Tuesday away from real damage. If they know it, they carry tension. If they do not know it, they often compensate through denial, display, or avoidance. Neither is healthy. The reserve fund interrupts that pattern. It tells reality. You do not get to dictate the mood of this household every time you arrive uninvited. That is worth a great deal. By the time a person reaches this point, a subtle but profound psychological reversal has occurred. At the beginning, saving felt like deprivation. Now saving begins to feel like relief. At the beginning, the untouched balance felt frustrating. Now the untouched balance feels reassuring. At the beginning, holding cash felt like postponing life. Now holding cash feels like protecting the conditions that make a better life possible. That reversal matters, because from there the next stages become easier to understand. A person who has learned what reserves do for the mind is better prepared to appreciate what investing does for the future. The order matters. Build some stability. Then ask capital to work harder. Do not force a fragile household to imitate an institution. Households need liquidity, resilience, and flexibility before they need complexity. That is not cowardice. That is sane sequencing. There is no honor in putting every dollar at risk while your everyday life remains exposed. Some people hear that and think I am praising hoarding. I am not. Money should eventually work. But before it works for you in markets, it should work for you in life. It should make you less easy to corner. It should make you less likely to borrow expensively. It should make you less likely to sell cheaply. It should make you less likely to accept abuse. It should make you less likely to confuse urgency with necessity. That is work. And for many people, $10,000 is the first amount that performs that work at a meaningful scale. If you are still below it, do not romanticize the far horizon so much that you ignore the near hill. The near hill matters. The first meaningful reserve is not a side quest. It is not an optional preface before real finance begins. For most people, it is the moment real finance begins. Before that, finance is often just reaction. After that, finance can become intention. That is a different life. You do not need to be dramatic about it. You do not need to announce it. You do not need to look rich. You do not need to pretend $10,000 is more than it is. You only need to understand what it changes. It changes the amount of chaos you can absorb. It changes the number of bad bargains you are forced to accept. It changes the quality of your sleep. It changes the tone inside your home. It changes how boldly and how intelligently you can plan. It changes whether your future must always kneel before the next inconvenience. And because it often changes the direction of an entire adult life. When I look back over decades of capital allocation, business behavior, and human behavior, I come back to one plain observation. The biggest advantages are often quieter than people expect. A little room, a little patience, a little resilience, a little cash, a little ability to say, no, not under those terms. That does not sound glamorous. It sounds almost boring. But boring is underrated. Boring keeps people in the game. And the people who stay in the game with their judgment intact are the ones who eventually get the full benefit of compounding. So if a person asked me when money starts to feel different, I would not begin with the first million. I would begin much earlier. I would begin at the point where ordinary life can no longer terrorize them with every minor surprise. I would begin at the point where an emergency becomes an expense instead of an identity crisis. I would begin at the point where choices are no longer chained entirely to the next paycheck. I would begin at the point where self-respect is backed by liquidity. For many people, that point arrives when the reserve crosses $10,000, not because the number makes them extraordinary, because the number finally allows them to behave like a person with a future instead of a person surrounded by traps. And once a person begins behaving like someone with a future, many other good things become possible. That is how financial lives change, not always through spectacle, often through margin, often through a cash balance no one else sees, often through the silent confidence that comes from knowing tomorrow may still bring trouble. But trouble will no longer be allowed to run the household by itself.